A low sun hangs over a white horizon. The wind moves like a blade. In the far distance, a concrete shape crouches on the coast, half ruin, half fortress, its windows filmed with rime. A narrator's breath would fog the lens here, at the edge of the Chukchi Sea. Locals call it Ir-Kapaya. On Soviet maps, it is Cape Schmidt. What happened up here, under the aurora and the polar night? A battle? A myth? A fragment of the Eastern Front blown to the very rim of the world? This is the story of the Arctic War, how the Soviet North fought in temperatures that turned metal brittle and lungs to knives, and how a place like Cape Schmidt became a symbol of endurance, logistics, and rumor in equal measure. First, a careful step back. The Eastern Front is often drawn as a band from Leningrad to Stalingrad to the Caucasus. But in truth, the war stretched upward, into storm-black seas and islands with names many maps ignored. The Soviet Northern Fleet guarded Murmansk and the Kola Peninsula. British and American convoys groped through fog toward Arkhangelsk. German raiders and U-boats threaded the pack ice of the Kara Sea. And far to the east, across the Bering Strait, an air bridge, Alaska to Siberia, carried Lend-Lease aircraft to the Red Army. All of it was Arctic. All of it was at the limits of human endurance. And Cape Schmidt? It stands on the Chukchi coast, thousands of kilometers from Murmansk or the Barents Sea, where most naval battles raged. Today, you can still see a Cold War airbase built there in the 1950s. Concrete, coastal batteries, and a runway stenciled onto permafrost. In wartime, the Chukotka shore was a waymark for pilots, a line on weather maps, a hard northern boundary to watch. But was there a Battle of Cape Schmidt during the Second World War? Contested. The archival record for an actual firefight at Cape Schmidt in 1941-45 is thin to non-existent. Soviet Arctic combat clustered west, the Kola Coast, the White and Barents Seas, Novaya Zemlya, the Kara Sea. In the far northeast, the guns were usually silent. The closest roars were across the water, where American forces fought in the Aleutians in 1942-43. What Cape Schmidt did have, even before the base, was weather, supply stops, and human stories of survival. The temperatures of -40 degrees Celsius the far north knows well. The war knew them too. So the ice fortress in our title is not a single bunker on a single headland. It is the entire defensive belt of the Soviet Arctic. Ports, peninsulas, islands, weather huts, and convoys. Fortified not only by concrete, but by cold, geography, and will. And like every fortress, it was tested. We begin where the northern lights often arc, the Kola. June 1941. Within days of the German attack, the Soviet Northern Fleet, destroyers, submarines, minesweepers, scrambled to defend Murmansk, the only ice-free port the USSR had in the Arctic. The Luftwaffe targeted docks and railheads. On the tundra, Soviet troops and naval infantry fought in the rocky teeth of the Rybaki and Sredny peninsulas. The front here did not move like the panzers on the steppe. It froze and snarled among fjords and ridges. Patrols traded rifle shots through the fog. Night and day became moods, not times. "Your compass lies," a sailor wrote in a letter, "and your breath betrays you. The frost makes it visible to the enemy." The sentence is remembered not as poetry, but as a field note from men who learned that a rifle bolt could tear skin at 40 below, and that the simplest task, starting an engine, was a campaign in miniature. Heat the oil, warm the carburetor with a stove, crank, pray. Across the Atlantic, Britain and America prepared a different kind of offensive: cargo. Trucks, locomotives, aircraft, fuel, tinned food, boots, mountains of it. The Arctic convoys, codenamed PQ and QP at first, then JW and RA, had to run a gantlet around the North Cape of Norway, past German aircraft, U-boats, and surface raiders. Ice on the rigging, ice on the eyelashes. Men chipped it away with axes to keep ships from capsizing. They sailed in blackout, through waters where even the sea seemed to whisper coordinates to the enemy. The convoys' names are written with dates that sound like coordinates too. PQ-17, July 1942, scattered by order, then savaged by waiting U-boats and bombers. JW-51B, December 1942, a test of the Royal Navy met in the Battle of the Barents Sea, beating back German cruisers and destroyers. A year later, in December 1943, the Battle of the North Cape ended the threat of the battleship Scharnhorst. Each success and failure was measured in tonnage landed at Murmansk and Arkhangelsk, and in Soviet formations resupplied on the Volkhov or in the ruins of Stalingrad months later. The convoys were lifelines, not metaphors. In the summer of 1942, German plans shifted toward the Soviet Arctic shores themselves. Operation Wunderland, a surface raider thrust into the Kara Sea to disrupt Soviet shipping east of Novaya Zemlya. The heavy cruiser Admiral Scheer, gray and massive, picked its way through floes. It shelled a Soviet icebreaker. Then it turned for Dikson, a polar settlement on the edge of the Yenisei Gulf, where a handful of coastal guns, museum pieces in any other war, fired stubbornly. The raider bombarded the port but withdrew. The Arctic, like a fortress whose walls are weather, had blunted a heavier foe. What does this have to do with Cape Schmidt? Listen to the geography. Wunderland was the westering of German steel into the Kara Sea, probing Soviet sea lanes and weather stations. The Soviet response used signals, ice reports, and ships that could nose through flow fields, icebreakers with anti-aircraft guns, patrol boats with rails rimed white. The spine that ran from Arkhangelsk toward the Bering Strait was not made of trenches. It was made of cabins with meteorological instruments, of wireless masts, of outlying airstrips scratched out of gravel and permafrost. And on the far right end of that spine, looking toward Alaska, lay Chukotka, with hamlets like Van Karum, Yulin, and the headland we name Cape Schmidt. Here, the war's presence was quieter but persistent. Weather messages ticked outward into a network that fed fleets and convoys. Pilots ferrying Lend-Lease aircraft across the Alaska-Siberia route through Nome, Yulkul, Samchan, Yakutsk sometimes looked down on coasts like this one, noting wind, drift, and ice. Soldiers kept watch for any prowler on the horizon. In winter, -40 degrees was not a headline, but a shift condition. Estimated. Local reports tell of alerts against possible submarines in the Chukchi Sea in 1942-43, and of extra coastal patrols during the Aleutian fighting. Documentary confirmation is uneven. The region saw militarization, yes, and intense logistics in late 1944 and 1945 as the USSR prepared for its August campaign against Japan. But if you search for a set-piece clash, guns blazing at Cape Schmidt, you leave the firm deck of records and step onto thin ice. Let us return to where the war's teeth were hard and visible. July 1941. A small Soviet convoy huddles near Cape Terabirsky, east of Murmansk, trying to slip supplies along the Kola coast. German destroyers sweep in through fog. Shells streak over the water. A Soviet minesweeper heaves in its own shrapnel storm. The Arctic has no theater seats. The cliffs themselves are the audience. Gulls the only witnesses that don't take sides. The gun duel lasts minutes that feel like an hour. Then the Germans are gone, leaving wakes and black smoke. The supplies get through. Somewhere far away, a rifle platoon will not run short of cartridges next week. October 1944. The Petsamo-Kirkenes offensive. After 3 years of stalemate and raids, the Soviet 14th Army and Northern Fleet moved to eject German forces from the far north of Finland and Norway. Naval infantry landings stab into inlets. Destroyers provide gunfire. Ski troops cross tundra. The days are already short. The weather is a participant. In ruined ports, the smoke smells of cordite and fish. When the operation ends, the German hold on the Arctic coast of the USSR is broken. The convoy's approaches are safer. The ice fortress tightens its belt. A sailor wrote about the darkness. At noon, the horizon looks like dusk. We tie ropes along the deck so men can find their way in blizzards. If you fall overboard, the rule is to throw a life ring and mark the spot. But in these waters, the truth is cruel. 2 minutes can be too long. No one fights the cold. They negotiate with it. Not all the actors wore uniforms. Chukchi and Yupik hunters, fewer in number than their ancestors because the century had already been hard, knew the sea ice as a road. During the war, some guided patrols carried messages by dog team, or simply gave the most precious thing one can offer here: advice about weather and routes. Don't trust the lead. It looks strong, but is new ice. The wind will turn north after midnight. Small sentences that can save a convoy of sleds or a squadron's mission. Imagine a Liberty ship in a winter hurricane between Bear Island and the Kola. The temperature drops. The spray hits the bow and freezes instantly. The ice climbs in sheets up the rails and stanchions. Axes ring on steel. Men work in pairs in case one falls senseless. In the engine room, the thermometer climbs. Windows mist. The air smells of oil and hot metal. On deck, it cuts like glass. Overhead, a strip of sky clears and the aurora unrolls, pale green, as if war has paused to reveal that the planet is stranger and larger than it. Cold changes every calculation. A rifle's oil must be the right grade or the bolt will seize. A ship's fire hoses must be run, drained, and coiled quickly, or they become clubs of ice. Radio batteries lose strength. Aircraft require long warm-ups. Hydraulic lines can turn sluggish. On-shore, concrete poured in the Arctic needs special mixes, and even then will crack if hurried. The fortress was not only the weather, it was the adaptation to it. We return to Cape Schmidt with the weight of this context. Wartime photographs show camps and depots along the Chukchi coast, but the airfield and the heavy coastal base many visitors see today date from the mid-1950s, not the days of convoy battles. Soviet planners, who had learned the Arctic's strategic value the hard way, built airstrips all along the north, from Franz Josef Land to the Kolyma. Cape Schmidt joined them in a later chapter. During the war itself, the battle here was one of vigilance, supply, and readiness in conditions that qualify as combat even when no shot is fired. To say so is not to diminish the far northeast. It is to place it correctly in the atlas of the Arctic War. The hottest firelight burned near Murmansk. The Kara Sea flickered with raiders and icebreakers. The Far East listened and prepared, then stirred in 1945 when the Soviet Union entered the war against Japan and forces moved toward the Kurils and Sakhalin. If the myth of a named battle at Cape Schmidt persists, it likely grows from the base's later bones and the genuine heroics of the broader polar front. Let us linger at Dikson again, because what happened there captures the ice fortress more truly than any invented clash. When Admiral Scheer loomed out of fog, the defenders had little: aging guns, a few patrol craft, and the courage to man open emplacements in a hail of shell splinters. Civilians ran ammunition. Radio operators choked on dust, but they transmitted. Icebreakers went to steam. The German raider, armored and gunned, turned back before it could wreck the port. On maps in Berlin, it might have looked like a small dot. To the men on the quay, it was a city saved. To the rest of the Arctic network, it was a message: the ice would resist. There is a temptation in histories of extremity to turn the environment itself into a character: cruel, impartial, sublime. Here it is enough to say that the Arctic does not care for borders and slogans. It only enforces its own code. Yet human beings found ways to work with it. Ice pilots who could read the color of the water. Meteorologists who tuned instruments by feel. Shipwrights who learned how steel behaves in the white months. Infantry who knew that a white smock can be better than a bunker if you choose your drift and wait. A ferry pilot on the Alaska-Siberia route left a simple line in a notebook: "Cloud low, mountains invisible. Runway is a rumor until you see the windsock." On days like that, the coast near Cape Schmidt hovered in the periphery of the war. A reference point, a coastlight, a potential divert field. The aircraft he flew, P-39s or A-20s with fresh paint and English placards, would, weeks later, appear on the other side of a continent and add their small weight to battles with very different weather. The Arctic's contribution is often measured in numbers: thousands of aircraft delivered. But it can also be measured in these interlocked moments across a map. A weather report from the Chukchi shore enables a takeoff at Ulkow. A successful hop to Semchon prevents a loss. A saved aircraft becomes a squadron mate's wingman over Kursk. Consider the naval infantry. The Black Death, the Germans called them for their peacoats, who fought in the Arctic like mountaineers. They rode in landing craft along coasts where rocks hid beneath the surf like predatory shapes. In October 1944, they stormed beaches under snow flurries, crawling up shale slopes with grenades stuffed under their chests to keep them warm enough to detonate. Some wore canvas boots with felt liners. Others wrapped their feet in spare cloth. They were not elite in the parade ground sense. They were elite because the climate tested and retained only those who adapted. So, how do myths form? A visitor in the 1990s walks through an abandoned base at Cape Schmidt, finds artillery, sees the runway, hears elders speak of wartime alarms and cold beyond telling. A phrase is born, the Battle of Cape Schmidt. It passes from tongue to headline, loses its cautious qualifiers, and hardens into a tale. But this channel, this series, promises something else. The Soviet side of the war, verified and human. The truth is not smaller than the myth. It is larger because it includes everything that actually happened. It includes the radio operators who kept times and barometric pressures with pencil nubs in unheated huts. It includes convoy escorts banging depth charges off the stern while sheets of freezing spray shattered on their faces. It includes a chart on a wardroom table with pencil lines showing the ice limit shifting by kilometers in a single day. It includes the decision to send precious aircraft eastward through Alaska because the northern routes were the fastest and safest way to save the Soviet heartland. It includes, yes, people shivering at outposts on the Chukchi Sea, watching horizons that never quite bled into battle, but were always relevant to it. And the culmination, fittingly, happened not at a place named Schmidt, but at a name sailors knew by longitude and dread, the North Cape of Norway, December 1943. The German battlecruiser Scharnhorst tried to slash a convoy route. The Royal Navy met it in snow squalls. Using radar, the Arctic weather could not blind. Guns hammered in a world narrowed to blizzard and blast. When the ice smoke cleared, Scharnhorst was gone, and with it, much of the surface threat to the lifeline that fed the Soviet war effort. From that winter onward, the convoys endured, but with a weight lifted. In the white months of 1944 and the early dark of 1945, the Arctic Front, if we can call it a front, became a sequence of moppings up, patrols, escort duties, and engineering projects as the Red Army surged elsewhere. The fortress was not dismantled. It sank roots. After the war, planners looked at the map and saw lessons cast in permafrost. Airfields multiplied. Cape Schmidt became concrete. In a photograph from the late Cold War, a gray antenna rises out of snow, and a young conscript in a fur hat squints toward a sun that barely crests the south. He is not a veteran of the convoy battles. He is their heir. The Arctic does not lend itself to victory parades. Its medals are whispered. A ship that did not founder. A convoy that arrived. A squad that did not freeze. The Soviet Northern Fleet. The merchant mariners of many flags. The soldiers on peninsulas whose names sound like stones. Rybachi, Sredny, earned those medals in work as much as in battle. Their war was a rhythm. Chip ice, plot bearing, watch the sky, keep the engine warm, stay alive. And Cape Schmidt? Its claim to the Second World War is not a day of smoke and splinters, but a long season of vigilance. It is a witness rock on a coastline that guarded the right flank of a world at war. If a legend grew here, perhaps the Arctic itself planted it, because it has a way of making the human presence feel improbable and therefore epic. The truth is quieter, and for that reason, more powerful. Picture the wind dropping. The sea is dark and flat. A figure in a greatcoat steps from a hut, checks the thermometer, and writes a number that will feed into a forecast, that will guide a ship, that will protect a convoy, that will help an army marching a continent away. no gunfire. But the stakes are the same. The ice fortress held. Not at one cape, not in one battle, but in the entire arch of cold that runs from the Kola to the Chukchi. It held because men and women learned the language of the North and spoke it under duress. It held because lifelines were not romantic, they were maintained. It held, and the Eastern Front, so often measured by tank battles and city sieges, owed it more than most maps admit. If you stand at Cape Schmidt today, the wind says little, but the concrete listens. Somewhere out beyond the surf line, in water that can flash freeze breath, the ghosts of convoys still pass, gray on gray, slow, steady, bearing a memory the Arctic keeps with an austere kind of pride.